Daniel chapter 8, and I'm going to read the whole chapter. So Daniel 8 and verse 1. In the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Ram. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal. The horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew later. I watched the ram as it charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came towards the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people?" He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the king of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true. But seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. I went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding.
How long am I going to have to wait to know what's going on there? Perhaps it's a struggle with anxiety or temptation, addiction, depression, whatever it might be. How long am I going to have to struggle with these different things? Perhaps it's a less than desirable breakdown in a relationship at home or at work or somewhere else. How long am I going to have to struggle with that? As we've been considering the persecuted church this week, there will be many Christians in the world being persecuted for their faith, and may at times be calling out that cry, how long is this going to carry on, Lord? And of course, today of all days, thinking about that question around the world for those in war-torn situations, how long is this very real conflict and difficulty going to carry on? These are real burdens. These are real questions. And I think for each one of us, we can bring something to the table. Well, you're not alone. The great character in the Bible, David, the great king, thought the same things in Psalm chapter 13. I'd just like to read a few verses to you, and I wonder whether these might resonate with you. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer. Lord my God, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. David, for me, here is articulating the similar longings that we have. Lord, I'm suffering. Lord, it hurts. Lord, help me. Well, if that's you this morning, I want to encourage you. I think that Daniel 8 is going to give us some reassurance in our suffering and our difficulty. So let's dive in. So a bit of context for you. Daniel is another vision. We've seen two previously. This is the next one. We've seen them. This one takes place just before the fingers of a man's hand announced Belshazzar's doom in chapter 5. And we're within a decade of Israel's exile being over. It's been long, but we're nearly there. Daniel doesn't know that, but when symbol for the Persian Empire, carried by the king himself into battle, is a ram. Isn't that great? So Daniel receives a vision. That kingdom is represented by a ram. He doesn't know this yet, but that is the symbol that they will choose to carry into battle as they attack all over the place, left and right. Does that comfort you? Just to begin with, there's that level of specificity here in this vision that comes true. It becomes part of history. So we have our ram. But next, we see a goat. Look at verses 5 to 8. This goat appears, it makes progress very quickly, as shown by the phrase, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. Again, this goat was fearsome, charging with great rage and speed at the ram. The ram cannot withstand this attack. Again, the interpretation makes it clear in verse 21 that this goat represents the kingdom of Greece, that the large horn is its first king, none other, when we look back in history, than Alexander the Great, who conquered by great speed and great tactical genius. He was a furious warrior, unpredictable, but all-conquering. And we see that when it says the phrase, it shattered the ram's horns, knocked it to the ground, and trampled all over it. What we're seeing here, and again, what is confirmed to us in the history books, is the complete defeat and dismantling of the once great Medo-Persian Empire by the Greeks. We read in verse 8, have a look, that the goat became very great. Other translations use the phrases, things like puffed up. But can you see in verse 8 that the horn was broken off to be replaced by 4 other horns? When we look in history, we see Alexander conquer an amazing amount of territory, a huge kingdom. And yet his demise is actually quite sudden in history. It happens very early on in his life. He's in his 30s, and he's cut down in his prime. It's as if God has reached out, said enough, and snapped that horn of one of the greatest conquerors the world has ever known. We now know that the Greek Empire was split into 4 sections, ruled by 4 generals. The horn, if you like, is gone, that's been snapped, but there are 4 more horns that replace. Daniel is seeing from the row the pages of history being predicted before him with perfect clarity. this point, I'll be honest with you, I probably didn't know Daniel as well as I would have liked, and I certainly hadn't picked up on this point. Students all the time I teach studies, and one of the questions I get asked all the time is, how do you know the Bible is true? This is a great thing I'm going to be using from now on. Here we have this vision that gets written into the pages of history. I'm encouraged. I'm certainly encouraged. Daniel here could see turbulent times ahead of change, of kingdom after kingdom after kingdom coming. It involves lots of pain and a great difficulty and conflict, all the changes that we suffer with. But ultimately, it's all happening under the watchful gaze of God. And it's all happening in a perfect plan that he has. Not one of the rulers that I've mentioned so far was able to outlast God's perfect plan. And we've seen that time and again, haven't we, in our series? We might a great Medo-Persian empire, God sees a lopsided ram. Where we might mighty conquerors like Alexander the Great, he sees a woolly sheep. Even Alexander the Great is snapped in half at the proper time. You see, God sees our difficulties, but he sees them in comparison to his greater plans. Folks, times ahead, as they have been in the past, are going to be turbulent, aren't they? There's going to be change. There's going to be difficulty that comes at us, but ultimately, it is limited. He begins new things and he ends other things. There is a season for everything. In his time and in his way, in his control, nothing surprises him. This should give us great assurance in our prayers. The God who knows it all wants to draw near to us in those times of turbulence and change and difficulty and comfort us. See that there are turbulent times, but they are limited. Look at verse 9. We're going to move to our second point. Terrible, but limited suffering. We're going to be introduced to another character from the history books. In verses 9 to 14, we're now shown the next part of Israel's kind of future history. And this really does focus in, like a microscope, on what's going to happen in a particular part of the world, the Promised Land. We see in verse 9 of these four little horns that grew up to replace Alexander the Great is part of the Greek Empire. One of those grows up, and it's a little horn that steadily grows. Now we know that this refers to a character called Antiochus Epiphanes. He comes from the Seleucid quarter, those four quarters of the Greek Empire. We know that he battled against Egypt, Armenia, and Canaan. It says there in verse 9, he grew in power towards the Promised Land, having fought north and south. His kingdom grew until it reached the host of heaven and goes against the starry host. And we see that again in verse 10. This phrase, hosts of heaven and starry hosts, refers to the tribes of Israel, God's chosen people. And to sin against them is to sin against God himself. We now have to read in verse 11 some really, really difficult things about this character, Antiochus Epiphanes. So this little horn that steadily grew in power thought himself as great as God himself. He took away the temple sacrifice from the Jewish people, and he even went as far as to make the temple unusable because of the desecration that he caused. Had a little look at even worse, difficult things that he did, evil and awful things that he did to the Jewish people. He defiled the holy sanctuary with pig's blood. He put statues of Zeus in the temple. He made Jewish people eat forbidden foods on Shabbat. He killed as many as 80,000 Jews simply in retaliation to losing a battle against the Egyptians just because he happened to be going home that way. He outlawed circumcision. And there's even more that you can go away and read if you want to. But that gives a flavor as to the power of this man and how he chose to use it against God's people, against God himself. To say that he was is an understatement. He brought such suffering and persecution that the cry we started our sermon with this morning, how long, is seen in verse 13. See it. How long will this carry on? How long will this situation be allowed to? But we see in verse 14 a great encouragement to us. That although this suffering is so great for the Jewish people, it will end. It will come to an end. Lots of conjecture how long that. You can see some numbers there. Most people think it kind of means around 3 years in this case. 3 years, depending on the suffering you're in, can seem either a really short time or a really long time, can't it? Depends what we're talking about when we use that time frame. Even the Jewish historian Josephus wrote about this in future history. As it was happening, he wrote about it, and he ends his writing about this awful time in Jewish history by saying, it happened just as Daniel said in his vision. You see, for many, this vision we're reading about now, and particularly these passages, although terrible to read about, gave the Jewish people great comfort. They would recite this often because of this verse 14. It will end. They knew that God would bring this suffering to an end. And the same is true for us, isn't it? We worship the same God. It's limited. We have a God who is greater. And for those of us who know and trust the Lord, an ultimate destiny for us in eternity with him in heaven. No more crying, no more pain, no more death, no more disease. Terrible, yes, at the moment, but limited. And a hope and a future that is secure. As we him in prayer and in worship, we have a God who will not allow us to suffer forever. He will not allow our how longs to be longer than we can bear. And our how longs serve a purpose. They are part of a history. They are part of a plan being written. It is not pointless. Antiochus, just like Alexander the Great before him, was snapped like a twig. His horn shattered under seemingly sudden circumstances. Once again, it seems as if God said, enough, and it was done. So there will be turbulent times, but they are predicted. They don't surprise God. We've seen that there'll be terrible times, but they are limited. They will come to an end. And I just want to provide us with an encouragement as we come to the end this morning. As you see, our vision chapter seems to contain lots of lows, lots of suffering, lots of difficulty. We know this because the vision is interpreted, and at the end, Daniel is overcome with exhaustion for several days. Such is the impact of this vision on him. That's the impact on us, isn't it, at times with our suffering? We can't go on. We just can't hold it up any longer. And if we're not careful, sometimes we can leave it there. We can sit in that suffering. Yes, we know it will end. Yes, we know it's limited. Yes, we know it can. But there are some key phrases in this last part that I would like to just pick up on that lead us to the glory of the Lord Jesus clearly. Have a look with me in verses 24 and 25. The encouragement here is that this great but terrible king, look at verse 24, would become strong, but not by his power. And look in verse 25, he would be destroyed, but not by human power. Those two phrases, but not human power. As great as Antiochus Epiphanes would become, as one of the horns of the great goat, his power would not be enough to sustain him. and neither would any other humans be enough to destroy him. So there would need to be from for those things that happened. Well, I want to pick up on this phrase, horn, and I want to talk to you about a passage that we see in Luke chapter. You may know the story of Zechariah, promised who would become John the Baptist. He didn't believe it, and so he was made because of that. And it wasn't until he finally wrote down that his name would be John that he was given his voice back. First thing he says upon receiving his voice back, and if you want to, you can see it in verse 16. Have a look later if you'd like. It says this: his father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit. The following: praise be the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. Listen to this. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his holy prophets of long ago. Salvation from our enemies and of all who hate us. To show mercy to our ancestors, to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies, and to enable us to serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. See, Zechariah, with full knowledge of those horns that we've learnt about previously, was sending a horn of salvation, a ruler that would rule a kingdom that could never be defeated. And this same power that had snapped horns and reduced kingdoms to rubble, and now places this horn on an eternal throne, with what can be nothing but just amazing biblical symmetry. John the Baptist, later on in his life, upon seeing Jesus approach to be baptized, recognized Jesus as he really was. Behold the Lamb, Jesus Christ. To become as great as God, like Antiochus Epiphanes, rather to do his Father's will. He didn't come to demonstrate his might like the other horns that were seen, but rather he came as a baby. He spent his life prioritizing people over power. He even rode a donkey on his entrance into Jerusalem. And it is this same Jesus that is the answer to David's cry. Do you remember from Psalm 13? Look on me and answer, Lord God. Well, we have our answer. Jesus is that answer. Folks, there will be turbulent times ahead in our lives, but they are known to God already. They do not surprise him. Suffering is inevitable for the follower of Jesus, but it is limited, whether in this life or eternity. We worship the Lamb, who is the horn of salvation and a rescue to those who believe. He has triumphed over all who seek to distract us, who seek to make us suffer. We can pray, Lord, meet me in my suffering. Remind me who you are and what you have done in my life. I hope this morning you've seen the glory of God who knows all things. You've seen his sovereignty across history, snapping horns at their appointed time, ending suffering and kingdoms when he is ready. We've seen the rebellion of sinful man, haven't we? It's inevitable. But so is our eternal triumph in Jesus. Anything, I hope it causes you to want to draw near to Jesus even more in prayer and in worship. He is the answer to our heart's cry. He is the Lord's provision in those times.